What's up everybody, Dom here from Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. This weekend, I spent a lot of time with this guy, the Leica Q2. I was pretty impressed with this camera, so in today's video, I want to show you what I think this Leica camera has to offer. So in a nutshell, this is the second version of the original Leica Q, and we're basically seeing the same exact body, but internally we're seeing a lot of changes from the original Leica Q. This is a very stylish camera with a clean, minimal design, and it also features a Leica 28mm Summilux f1.7 lens, which, since it's a point and shoot, is firmly attached to the body. So, is this thing just a $5,000 fashion statement, or can it really deliver a remarkable image like Leica says? Leica. We're going to try to find that out, but first, let's talk about the build of this camera. The first thing I noticed about the Q2 is its sleek and modern design, yet it still pays homage to its analog predecessors with these rounded edges as if there's a roll of film inside, which is a signature Leica look. Like I said before, it's a very minimal camera with these large areas of empty space, and it is not overloaded with buttons by any means. That makes this camera really easy on the eyes, which unlike other cameras can sometimes feel overwhelmed with buttons and dials. The inner sort of skeleton of this camera is one solid hunk of magnesium alloy, and externally, just about everything on this camera is a nice, solid metal. And despite the lack of form-fitting hand grip that you would normally find on the right side like in any other camera, this camera is surprisingly easy to handle, and it feels really comfortable. This is a camera I wouldn't mind taking with me for a long day in the city for some street photography, because I wouldn't be worried about it if it was slung by my side or if I wasn't shooting or something like that. And it gives me total style points. And of course, this is a Leica camera we're talking about, so all of the dials and buttons feel amazingly robust, and I can tell we're very well made. I haven't tested this out, but they've even added some waterproofing, which is an improvement from the original Leica Q. Also, we have an improved battery from the original Leica Q. It's still not anything to write home about, but I was able to shoot for basically a day and a half on one battery. Also, quick note about the battery. I was a little confused about this at first, but you have to eject the battery with the lever, then give it a light push to unlock it from the safety lock. But now that I know how to do it, it's kind of oddly satisfying. The media slot is located in the bottom, and it is for one SD card, and they do recommend a UHS Type 2 SD card, and that's probably to keep up with the write speeds of these Adobe DNG files. It's got an excellent 3.6 megapixel electronic viewfinder, and I have glasses, so viewfinders are kind of hit or miss for me, and this thing is absolutely awesome. It's got this click out diopter, which is kind of neat, but operating it while looking through the viewfinder is a little tough, and it has an automatic eye sensor. We have a nice bright 3-inch LCD screen, which I can tell is very well built into this camera, and it has touchscreen capabilities as well, which is really cool. The menu is really well designed, and it's also pretty pleasing to look at, and you can also just mash the menu button to get through all the sub-menus, which I like because I'm a button masher. Also, that touchscreen function doesn't work in the actual menus themselves, just the quick menu. The shutter button is well placed and has a nice articulate click, and this is also where the collar for the on-off button is too. The shutter speed dial is located just to the left of this thumb rest here, and it's nice and easy to access, and it also doesn't have any hard stops, so it can just keep spinning and spinning in each direction. It also has this assignable thumb wheel dial with a button located all the way to the right that sits flush with the top of the body. We have a media, function, and menu button to the left of the LCD screen, which I think is a great place for them, and you can just click and hold the function button to assign it to something, which I thought was cool, but I would have liked to have been able to assign it to toggle between the different crop modes, but I couldn't do that. Like I said earlier, all of the dials and buttons on this camera feel very robust and have a great tactile response. Though with the thumb wheel, some people I asked said it was a little hard to operate, but I think that's because of where it's placed on the camera. I think it has to be a more deliberate push, because otherwise it would turn accidentally when just rubbing up against something. Okay, let's talk about this lens, because it's easily one of the best features of this camera. We have a Leica Summilux 28mm f1.7 lens with 3 aspherical elements, a 49-inch filter thread, and it is firmly attached to this body. I mean, it's really on there. I couldn't get it off as hard as I tried. And this is one thing that I love about this lens that I used a lot this weekend. And this is this macro ring that's all the way towards the base of the lens. when you switch it, it unlocks your macro focusing range, and that's not the cool part. What's cool about it is that when you spin it, it reveals these hidden focusing increments, which I think is a really cool design choice. Outside of macro, it's got a 1 foot minimum close focusing distance, and in macro, that brings it down to about 6 inches. But in macro mode, the camera will automatically cap out your aperture at 2.8. So a 28mm lens is a unique choice for this point and shoot, when a lot of people would probably prefer or even expect 35mm. But with a 47 megapixel sensor, I think Leica is encouraging the users of the Q2 to try out these crop modes that they've programmed into this camera. This is going to allow you to crop into 35, 50, or 75mm focal length modes, and those are all still going to look perfectly acceptable, and I'll show you how those focal lengths end up in megapixels right here. So there's also going to be no visible distortion at 28mm, and personally, I really liked shooting on this focal length. I pretty much shot on 28mm all weekend, and I didn't even really touch those crop modes. The focusing ring is nice and smooth and articulate and has about 90 degrees of throw. One interesting quirk about this focus ring is that if you want to switch from manual to autofocus, you have to turn all the way to infinity until it stops, press this little button on this little block here at the end of the lens, spin it just a bit further, and then that locks it into autofocus mode. For how great the tactile response is for every other single thing on this camera, I gotta say that this never feels right when I'm doing this, and I always feel like I'm doing something wrong. Last thing about the build of the lens, and this is kind of nitpicky, but it's a little small, and so everything is a little squished together. And sometimes I find myself searching for this focus ring because my hands don't land on it first try every time. Optically, this lens delivers an excellent image. It's very sharp, the colors render nicely, and it manages flares very well. It's f1.7, so you can get some nice large bokeh, especially in macro mode. Basically, this lens sensor combo is absolutely killer for high resolution imagery. All right, let's talk about how the Leica Q2 performs. So quick note before we talk about performance, there was a recent firmware update on this camera, the 2.0, that cleared up a lot of issues from the original release. Most notably, we have the addition of 3 AF field sizes, and also they increased the DNG writing speeds, so they're up to 2 times faster. There are a bunch of other minor corrections in that update, but back to that write speed thing, I can confirm. I was shooting on a SanDisk Extreme Pro UHS Type 1, and when I was shooting in high drive DNGs, I found that the camera got really choked up with buffer times, and it took me as long as up to like 5 or 6 seconds to be able to preview some of the things that I just shot. Okay, so anyways, back to this camera. It's got a 47.3 megapixel sensor, which offers 14 stops of dynamic range and 14-bit color depth. Now, most of the DNG files that you're gonna get from this camera are gonna be around 84 or 85 megabytes, but I did have a couple of oddballs in the upper 80s and lower 90s, probably when the sensor was overloaded with color. But I'll get into that when we take a look at these photos in Lightroom. The JPEGs from this camera look really great, but obviously they have less wiggle room to work with than those raw DNG files, but they still look pretty good. The sensor has a bit of a hard time dealing with highlights, but on the other end of things, it treated shadow values really well. The autofocus in this camera is nice and fast in single shot. It's contrast based, so you're gonna need a little bit of contrast in that autofocus area that you choose. But in continuous autofocus, there are a couple of caveats here. I wouldn't rely on the continuous autofocus to do anything that sophisticated. It's there if you want it, but this is truly a single shot autofocus camera. Okay, the Leica Q2 does have some options for high drive shooting modes. You can get about 10 or 11 shots in the super speed mode until the buffer runs out, but honestly, when I did this, it choked up the camera a lot, and I wasn't able to preview those pictures until like 10 seconds later. The stabilization in this camera is pretty fair. It's got optical stabilization in the lens. There aren't that many options to fine-tune the stabilization, which is okay. And a couple of people I asked who shot on this camera said that they were comfortable hand-holding this camera all the way down to 1/8 shutter speed. So that must mean it's pretty good. The shutter system on the Leica Q2 is a leaf shutter, so it's actually located in the rear of the lens and not right in front of the sensor plane of the camera. The shutter on this camera is extremely quiet, and that's probably partially due to that it's a point and shoot and everything is just kind of sealed in here. I don't see any reason why you would need to go into an electronic shutter mode on this camera for noise reduction. This weekend I shot infants, puppies, cows, and people who I didn't want to know I was taking a picture of them. So having a near silent shutter was actually really, really nice. This camera has a base ISO of 50, which is probably why the dynamic range is so impressive, but also why I can't deal with highlights so well. Honestly, this whole weekend, I didn't really go past 1600 ISO, but maybe in another video, I'll test the ISO performance of this camera. Though from what I've seen from this camera, I don't think it deals that well past the 10,000 ISO region. The Leica Q2 does take video, although I would not say that this is a video camera by any means. It takes 4K DCI and MP4s, and they look pretty good. But the reason I say I would never shoot video on this camera is because of the utter lack of inputs and outputs. I mean, if you wanted to put this to use in a professional video setting, it would just be completely just camera and a lens. But I definitely wouldn't rely on the continuous autofocus, and I also wouldn't crank up the ISO too high. So obviously I wouldn't use this in a professional video setting, but it's there if I had it, and that's nice to know. So this weekend I got a variety of awesome content, from infant pictures to puppy pictures to cow pictures. All right, there's not that much variety. So let's look at some of those images in Lightroom and see what we're able to play with the image from the Leica Q2. Okay, first off, let's look at the image from the test chart. No surprise, it's completely sharp from corner to corner with absolutely no chromatic aberration. The only thing I can say that's wrong with this is that there's some extremely minimal ghosting in the corners. Other than that, the lens is clearly very resolute, especially paired up with this sensor. Okay, so these baby pictures were all JPEGs, and I think they held up pretty darn good considering. My main goal here was getting a rich amount of contrast on the baby's skin tones while maintaining an accurate yet slightly stylized color. Okay, so these next two sets of pictures, I'm going to clump together because I used pretty similar processes to edit them. But now we have some raw images, and this is going to give me way more information to work with while editing these pictures. These shots were taken at ISO 50, which is the camera's base, so theoretically I'm getting maximum dynamic range. The name of the game while editing these two shoots was shadow recovery. Most of these images would have been totally unusable if this wasn't possible. And from the Q2, there's a lot of room to work with there. Just by eye, it looks like I can bring up these shadow values the equivalent of like 6 stops in some cases, and they're still perfectly intact. The same can't be said for the other end though. Highlight recovery wasn't great, and a lot of the time, I was left with a blown out sky. But I'm not that surprised since the shadow recovery was so impressive, and it's usually one or the other. Let's take a quick moment to appreciate the resolution power of this camera. I mean, look at this. That's insane detail. And that's all at f1.7. Lastly, I have a few pics from in the city. Now this is where I cranked up the ISO and did some bokeh tests. Also, I guess I lied earlier when I said I didn't take the Q2 over 1600 ISO because this image was taken at 2000. But regardless, it still looks totally clean, and any grain that's noticeable is honestly kind of pleasing in my opinion. Also, this is a quick bokeh test I did where I set the lens in macro and then focused it to its closest possible close focusing distance, and I intentionally framed it so there's a bokeh at the very top left and very bottom left of this image, just to show how there's absolutely no distortion in this lens. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up this video on my experience with the Leica Q2. And my general impression is that I really liked it, and it's a fun camera to shoot with, but I would never buy one. It is capable of delivering a really stunning image that has a lot of room to work with in post, and you could pull off using the Leica Q2 in a professional scenario if you really wanted to. But for $5,000, you could get another perfectly good photo camera and splurge on a lens or 3. But who gets a Leica to be practical? So if you have any questions about the Leica Q2, or think that I didn't cover something that I should have, or you just have anything in general to add to our discussion, drop a comment in the comment section. And if you liked this video, make sure you hit that like button, and if you're not already, subscribe to the channel so you can stay tuned in for more weekly content. and we'll see you in the next one.